My husband ignored me during a house fire to save his mistress, and soon after I discovered she was the one who set our home on fire to be with him. People always ask me when I knew something was wrong. The truth is, I knew the moment I smelled smoke at 3 in the morning, and my first instinct wasn't to wake my husband sleeping beside me. 5 months pregnant, half asleep, and somewhere deep in my gut, I understood that calling him would be a mistake. So I grabbed my phone and dialed 911 instead. The dispatcher's voice was calm, professional, asking me questions I could barely process while smoke crept under our bedroom door. I remember thinking how strange it was that I'd rehearsed this moment in my head dozens of times, married to a firefighter for 4 years, and yet here I was, genuinely terrified and alone. I told her I was pregnant, told her about the smoke, told her I couldn't get to the front door because flames were already visible in the hallway. She kept me on the line while I crawled to our bedroom window, the one that opened onto the backyard. My husband didn't even stir. He'd taken a sleeping pill before bed, said he needed to rest properly before his shift the next day. Heavy sleeper normally, but medicated? He wouldn't wake up for anything short of an explosion. By the time I heard the sirens, I'd managed to get the window open and was halfway through it, my swollen belly making everything awkward and slow. The fresh air hit my face just as I heard his voice in the front yard, shouting orders to his crew. Station 17, his station. Of course it would be his station. I should have felt relief. Instead, I felt something cold settle in my chest. The thing about being married to a firefighter is that everyone assumes you're safe, protected, that you've got someone who runs into burning buildings for a living, so obviously he'd move heaven and earth for you. What they don't tell you is that heroes in public can be something else entirely in private. Not abusive, not exactly, just distant, distracted. Like you're a responsibility he checks off a list rather than someone he chose to love. I dropped into the backyard just as a piece of burning timber crashed through the bedroom window behind me. The heat was incredible. I started moving toward the side of the house, toward the voices, toward help, my hands instinctively cradling my belly. That's when I saw her. She was standing on our front lawn in a nightgown, crying, covered in soot. My husband's ex-girlfriend, the one he'd dated for 2 years before me, the one he said had been unstable and couldn't let go. She worked as a dispatcher now. Different county, different life, or so I'd been told. I watched him run to her. Not to our house, not to look for me. To her. One of the other firefighters, a guy I recognized from station barbecues, was the first to notice me standing there like an idiot in my pajamas. He called out, started jogging over, but by then I was staring at my husband with his arms around her, stroking her hair, his face buried in her neck, the way he used to hold me, back when we were new. The firefighter reached me, started asking if I was hurt, but I couldn't stop watching them. She was sobbing into his chest, and he was murmuring something to her. And I realized with perfect clarity that I was witnessing something I wasn't supposed to see. Not the affair itself, I'd suspected that for months, but the tenderness, the intimacy, the way he was with her in public, unconcerned about who might be watching. My husband suddenly looked up, saw me standing there with the other firefighter. For a moment, our eyes met across the lawn. Then he shouted something to his crew, gestured emphatically toward his ex-girlfriend. "Victim here. She's in shock. I need paramedics now." His voice carried authority, urgency, the kind of command that made people move without questioning. The crew mobilized immediately, converging on her. She was front and center, visible, dramatic, crying loudly. I was further back, partly in shadow, still trying to process what was happening. My husband positioned himself between her and where I stood, his body creating a visual barrier. The team was focused on containing the fire and attending to the obvious victim their commander had indicated. Then the questions started from the firefighter beside me. Where had I been? How did the fire start? Why was I outside alone? His tone shifted from concern to suspicious in about 30 seconds. Was I sure I'd called 911? Because they'd only received one call. Was I sure I hadn't started the fire myself? People did strange things when they were upset. Had my husband and I been fighting? Was I angry about something? Another crew member joined us, a younger guy with suspicious eyes. They flanked me, these 2 large men in full gear, while I stood there in pajamas covered in soot. I found myself being interrogated in my own front yard while my house burned behind me, and my husband comforted his ex-girlfriend 15 feet away. The questions came faster. Why was she here? Had I invited her? Had I confronted her? Was I jealous? Did I have a history of mental illness, depression, anxiety? Had I been taking any medications? I tried to explain that I'd called 911, that I'd climbed out the bedroom window, that I didn't know why she was here, that I'd never invited her, that I just wanted help. But they kept circling back, asking the same questions in different ways, trying to catch me in a contradiction. Like I was a suspect instead of a victim. Like my burning house was a crime scene, and I was the primary person of interest. One of them actually asked if I'd been fighting with my husband, if I'd been jealous, if maybe I'd done something to get attention, to force him to choose between us. The word hung in the air like an accusation, heavy and ugly. Jealous. Like that explained everything. Like being a jealous wife justified being left to bleed on a lawn while your house collapsed around you. That's when I smelled gasoline. Not smoke anymore, but gasoline, sharp and chemical. I'd smelled it before, in our garage, when my husband would fill containers for the lawn equipment. The firefighter closest to me noticed my expression change and asked what was wrong. But before I could answer, something inside the house exploded. Not a Hollywood explosion, more like a loud thump that made the remaining windows blow outward. I started to move toward the house, some idiotic instinct to grab something, anything from what was left of our life. The firefighter grabbed my arm, yanked me back, and I stumbled. My foot caught on something in the grass and I went down hard on my side. Not hard enough to really hurt, just hard enough to be shocking. He apologized, helped me up, but the damage was done. I felt it then. A pulling sensation low in my abdomen. Not painful exactly, more like a warning. Like, my hand went to my belly, and I looked up to see my husband finally looking at me. Our eyes met across the lawn, and I saw something in his face I'd never seen before. Not concern, not love, something closer to calculation. The ex-girlfriend said something to him, tugging on his arm, pulling his attention back. He turned away from me and led her toward one of the ambulances. I watched them go, this strange numbness spreading through my chest, and thought about how I'd wake up tomorrow in a hotel somewhere, or at my sister's house 3 hours away, and have to figure out what the hell had just happened to my life. That's when the porch roof collapsed. The section directly above where I would have been standing if I'd gone through the front door. The section that would have crushed me if I'd waited inside like a good wife for my firefighter husband to rescue me. The beams came down in a shower of sparks and burning wood. And something about the angle, the way it fell, sent a piece of debris flying across the lawn. It hit me in the stomach. Not huge, maybe the size of a dinner plate, but heavy and still burning. I felt it more than saw it, this sudden pressure and heat. And then I was on the ground again, this time on my back, staring up. Someone was screaming. I think it was the pulling sensation became pain, real pain, spreading through my abdomen like fire, like something tearing. I tried to curl around it, protect it, but I couldn't move. My hands found wetness on my nightgown darken, and I thought, this is bad. A face appeared above me. The neighbor from 3 houses down, the older man I'd waved to maybe twice in 4 years. He was on his phone, shouting about an emergency, about a pregnant woman. There's someone hurt over here, a pregnant woman bleeding. Why isn't anyone helping her? His voice was raw with panic and anger. One of the firefighters finally looked over, started moving toward us. But it had been nearly a minute since I'd fallen, since the debris hit me, since I'd started bleeding. 60 seconds that felt like hours. The firefighter's eyes went wide when he saw the blood. He called for the paramedics, but they were already loading the ex-girlfriend into the ambulance. My husband was climbing in beside her. The neighbor pressed something against my stomach, and I wanted to tell him it hurt, but I couldn't seem to make words anymore. Everything was getting fuzzy around the edges. I could hear urgent radio chatter, someone calling for a second ambulance, but it all seemed far away. The last thing I remember before everything went gray was the sound of the first ambulance pulling away, siren wailing, carrying her to safety. My husband was inside with her. I knew without seeing. Knew it the way you know things in dreams, with perfect certainty. The neighbor's face was wet, I realized. He was crying while he tried to keep me conscious. This stranger who owed me nothing. Then everything went dark. I woke up in a hospital room that smelled like disinfectant and disappointment. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. That constant institutional hum that reminded you this wasn't a place for living, just for surviving. The first thing I saw was the neighbor, still there, asleep in a chair by the window. His phone was in his lap, screen dark. He looked uncomfortable. His neck bent at an angle that would hurt when he woke up. The second thing I saw was my sister, awake and alert, her hand wrapped around mine so tight it almost hurt. Her eyes were red-rimmed and puffy, and I could see a coffee cup on the bedside table that she'd probably been nursing for hours. The third thing I registered was the absence. The hollow feeling where the weight had been. My hand moved to my stomach, flat now except for the bandages, and I didn't need anyone to say it. I knew. That immediate knowledge, that visceral understanding that something fundamental had changed in my body, hit me harder than any words could have. My sister started talking, words tumbling over each other, about the surgery and the blood loss and how lucky I was to be alive. Lucky. I let her talk. Let her fill the silence with explanations I already understood. The baby was gone. The damage was extensive. They'd had to perform an emergency hysterectomy. I was 32 years old and would never carry another child. When she finally ran out of words, I asked about my husband. Her expression went cold in a way I'd never seen before. He'd stayed at the hospital for 45 minutes after I arrived, she said. Stayed just long enough to sign some paperwork to be seen. Then he'd left with her, the ex-girlfriend, claiming she needed someone to stay with her because of the trauma. The neighbor, whose name I learned was Patrick, woke up then. He looked older in the hospital lighting, more fragile, but his eyes were sharp when they met mine. He asked if I wanted to see the video. Video. Right. Everyone has cameras now. Security cameras, doorbell cameras, phones that record everything. Patrick had one of those video doorbells, the kind that activates on motion. It had captured everything from the moment the ex-girlfriend's car pulled up outside my house at 2:47 in the morning until the ambulance left with her inside at 4:32. I watched it on his phone, watched her get out of her car with a gas can, watched her walk around to our back door, the one we always forgot to lock, watched her go inside, watched smoke start pouring from the windows 12 minutes later, watched her try to leave through the back but hesitate at the door, the flames already spreading faster than she'd expected, blocking her planned exit route, watched her panic, try the side window, struggle with it. By the time she got out, sirens were already audible. Watched her make a split-second decision, strip off her jacket and roll in the grass, coating herself in soot and ash before my husband arrived. Watched the whole performance. But that wasn't the video that mattered. Patrick had started recording on his phone when he realized the firefighters weren't helping me. 47 seconds of me lying on the lawn, clearly visible, clearly bleeding, while my husband's crew worked around me like I was invisible. My husband shouting about the critical victim who needed immediate attention, directing all resources to his ex-girlfriend. 47 seconds of him holding her, loading her into the ambulance, never once looking back at his wife. The video had already been posted. Patrick's daughter-in-law, apparently some kind of social media expert, had put it on every platform she could think of while I was in surgery. It had been shared 40,000 times in 6 hours. The comments were exactly what you'd imagine. Rage, disbelief, calls for investigation. My sister showed me her phone next. The fire department had released a statement. They were investigating the incident and couldn't comment on ongoing situations. But someone had leaked something to the press, some preliminary report that painted me as the unstable one, as a jealous wife who'd started the fire herself, who'd attacked the ex-girlfriend when she'd innocently stopped by to return some old belongings, who'd deliberately injured herself for attention when her husband wouldn't leave his duty to coddle her. The narrative was already shifting. Poor firefighter, married to a crazy woman, dedicated first responder, forced to choose between professional duty and personal drama. The ex-girlfriend was being described as a victim, a woman terrorized by her ex's unhinged wife. I asked my sister to get me a lawyer. Not just any lawyer, I said. Someone who specialized in this kind of thing. Someone mean. She understood immediately. The lawyer arrived 8 hours later. Her name was Catherine, 60-something, expensive suit, and eyes like a shark. She sat down, opened her briefcase, and asked me to tell her everything. Not the emotional stuff, she said. Facts, timeline, evidence. I told her about Patrick's videos, about the security camera I'd had installed inside our house 6 months ago, the one my husband didn't know about because I'd hidden it in a smoke detector in the hallway, the one that would have recorded everything before the fire destroyed it. She asked if it backed up to the cloud. I said yes, said I'd set it up that way specifically because I'd started to feel unsafe in my own home, though I couldn't have explained why at the time. Catherine smiled then, and it wasn't a nice smile. She made some calls, and within 2 hours we had the files downloaded. 16 hours of footage from the week before the fire, plus the crucial 40 minutes before the flames destroyed the camera. We watched it together on her laptop. Watched the ex-girlfriend let herself in with a key I didn't know she had. Watched her walk through my house like she owned it. Touching things, moving things. She opened drawers in our bedroom, looked through my clothes, ran her hands over the furniture. There was something possessive about her movements. Territorial. She was reclaiming space she thought should have been hers. Watched her pour gasoline in a careful trail from the back door through the kitchen and down the hallway toward the bedrooms. She worked methodically, carefully, like she'd practiced this. The gas can was half empty when she finished. She stood in the hallway for a moment, looking toward our bedroom where I was sleeping, where my husband was sleeping next to me after taking that pill he'd told her about. Watched her light it. A simple flick of a lighter. The flames caught immediately, racing along the gasoline trail faster than she'd expected. Her face changed. Panic. She turned to leave the way she'd come, but the fire had already reached the kitchen, was spreading across the floor between her and the back door. She tried the windows in the living room, but they were painted shut, old house problems we'd never fixed. By the time she made it to the side window and forced it open, precious seconds had passed. Seconds that would have been my death if I'd still been inside. But that wasn't all. Catherine went back further, pulled up footage from 3 days before. My husband and his ex-girlfriend in my living room, having a conversation I couldn't hear but could read through body language. Her crying, gesturing emphatically, him comforting her, stroking her hair, then them sitting together on my couch, his arm around her shoulders. He pulled out his phone, showed her something that made her lean in close. Floor plans, maybe. The layout of the house. She nodded slowly, asked questions he answered with gestures. Then he reached into his pocket and handed her something small. A key. She held it up to the light, testing it, then tucked it into her purse. They sat there for another 10 minutes, going over details. At one point, he pulled her close and kissed her forehead, the way you'd comfort someone before they did something difficult. The way you'd reassure a co-conspirator. Planning. They'd been planning this. In my house. On my couch. While I was at work, thinking my husband was home alone on his day off. Catherine said the charges would be severe. Attempted murder, arson, conspiracy. The fire department would be sued for negligence. My husband would lose everything. I asked how long it would take. She said months, maybe years. I asked what I should do in the meantime. She said recover, document everything, and don't talk to him under any circumstances. She'd get a restraining order filed by the end of the day. My sister stayed with me in the hospital for 5 more days. Patrick visited every morning with coffee and updates from the neighborhood. The story had gone national. Someone had connected the dots between the social media video and the fire department's statement. Journalists were camped outside the station. My husband had been placed on administrative leave pending investigation. The ex-girlfriend had been arrested trying to board a plane to her parents' house in Arizona. She'd been charged with arson and attempted murder. The police had searched her apartment and found journals, dozens of journals filled with obsessive entries about my husband and their relationship. She'd never let go. He'd never asked her to. When I was finally discharged, my sister drove me to her house 3 hours away. I spent the first week mostly sleeping, letting my body heal while my mind tried to process what my life had become. Catherine called with updates. The security footage had been submitted as evidence. The fire department had opened an internal investigation. The preliminary investigation by the police revealed something I hadn't known. The ex-girlfriend had been investigated for arson once before, 7 years ago in another state. A former boyfriend's apartment had burned down under suspicious circumstances. She'd been questioned but never charged due to lack of evidence. The case had been dismissed, and she'd moved to our state shortly after. Catherine said we had a pattern now. A history. It made our case stronger. 3 weeks after the fire, Catherine called with news. One of the firefighters from my husband's crew had come forward. Not out of conscience exactly, she said, but because he'd realized his own career was on the line if he stayed silent. He'd provided recordings from the station, months of them, captured on his personal phone, conversations between my husband and his buddies about how I'd accused him of cheating, about the ex-girlfriend texting constantly. One recording in particular stood out. My husband, 2 months before the fire, telling another firefighter that he was trapped, that he'd made a mistake marrying me, that the pregnancy was making everything worse because now he'd never be free, that he wished there was a way to start over without it looking like his fault. The other firefighter had laughed and said something about accidents happening all the time. My husband hadn't laughed. He'd said yeah, quietly, like he was considering it. The ex-girlfriend's lawyer reached out through Catherine. She wanted to make a deal. In exchange for testimony against my husband, they'd recommend a reduced sentence. Catherine asked what I thought. I said I wanted to know everything first. The deposition was worse than I'd imagined. She sat across from us in a conference room, orange jumpsuit and hollow eyes, and told us everything. The room was cold, aggressively air-conditioned in that way government buildings always are. A court reporter sat in the corner, fingers moving silently over the stenography machine. My husband had been seeing her for 2 years, since 6 months into our marriage. He'd told her I was the mistake, that he'd married me too quickly after they broke up on impulse, trying to prove to himself he could move on. But he couldn't. He'd realized she was the one he wanted all along. She said he'd cry sometimes when they were together. Actually cry. Said he felt trapped, that every day with me was torture, that coming home to me made him feel like he was suffocating. She believed him. She thought she was saving him from a loveless marriage, rescuing him from a mistake. But divorce would look bad, he'd said. Would hurt his reputation, his standing at the station. Firefighters were supposed to be stable, reliable, family men, salt-of-the-earth types who stayed married, who honored their commitments. A messy divorce, especially from a pregnant wife, would raise questions among his superiors. His dream of making captain would evaporate. People would judge. They'd wonder what he'd done wrong. And if I fought the divorce, if I told people about the affair, his reputation would be destroyed. Then I got pregnant. That changed everything, she said. Before, he could have divorced me and moved on. It would have been messy but survivable. But a baby? Child support for 18 years. Custody battles. His paycheck split. His freedom gone. He'd be tied to me forever, even if he left. The thought made him physically ill, she said. He'd throw up sometimes after talking about it. So they'd made a plan. She would scare me, make me unstable, give him grounds for divorce and full custody if it came to that. Start small, escalate slowly. At first, it was just showing up places I'd be, coffee shops I frequented, the grocery store near our house, the park where I walked in the evenings. She'd smile at him in a way that was just intimate enough to notice, just familiar enough to make me doubt. She'd brush against him in passing. She'd laugh at things he said in a way that suggested inside jokes, shared history. Then came the text messages from unknown numbers. Messages that knew things only someone close to me would know. What I'd eaten for dinner. What show I'd watched. What time I'd gone to bed. My husband would comfort me when I'd show him, tell me I was imagining things, suggest maybe I was stressed about the pregnancy, that hormones could make you paranoid. He made me doubt myself, question my own perceptions, wonder if I was losing my mind the way pregnant women sometimes did. The gaslighting had been methodical, she explained. They'd researched it together, read articles about psychological manipulation, studied cases where it had worked. They wanted me to seem unreliable, emotional, potentially dangerous even. If I ever reported anything or tried to expose the affair, they'd have established a pattern of me being paranoid and unstable. No one would believe me. They'd think I was a jealous wife having a breakdown. She detailed it all dispassionately, like she was explaining a recipe. Do this for 2 weeks. Then add this element. Wait for the reaction. Escalate when she adapts. They had a timeline, she said. 6 months of psychological warfare. Then he'd file for divorce citing my mental instability. She'd provided him with screenshots of my paranoid texts, recordings of me accusing him of things he'd convinced me I'd imagined. He'd built a case file against me, documentation that would make me look unhinged in family court. But I'd gotten those security cameras instead of falling apart the way they'd expected. I'd started documenting things, keeping records, writing down incidents with dates and times. I'd become difficult to gaslight because I had proof that contradicted his reassurances, proof that someone really was watching me, that things really were happening. I wasn't crazy. I was being targeted. So they'd escalated to the final solution. The fire was supposed to look like an accident, she said, voice cracking slightly. Old wiring, the house was older. These things happen. Insurance would pay out. He'd be the grieving widower, sympathetic, tragic. After an appropriate mourning period, maybe a year, they could finally be together openly. No one would question it. Old college sweethearts reuniting after tragedy. People would think it was romantic. I was supposed to die in my sleep from smoke inhalation before the flames ever reached me, she explained. That's why he'd given her specific instructions. Pour the gasoline in the hallway, light it far from the bedroom, let the smoke do the work. It would be peaceful, he'd told her. Humane even. I wouldn't suffer. I'd just go to sleep and not wake up. The baby too. Quick, painless, merciful. He'd given her the key weeks before, she said. Told her exactly when to do it. He'd made sure he was on shift that night, made sure his crew would be the ones to respond. He'd taken the sleeping pill so he could claim he'd been in deep sleep afterward, unable to wake up despite his training. He'd even practiced his reaction, she said. The grief-stricken husband who'd somehow slept through his wife's death. He'd needed the story to be believable. Except I'd woken up. I'd gotten out. I'd survived. She'd panicked when the fire spread faster than expected when her exit was blocked. By the time she got out, she could hear sirens. She improvised the whole distraught ex-girlfriend act to give my husband cover. But she'd been so focused on her performance that she hadn't thought about cameras. My husband hadn't known about the security footage either. He'd thought it was all going to work, that he'd be free, that he'd grieve appropriately for a few months, that eventually he and his ex could be together without anyone thinking it was suspicious. I sat there listening to this woman describe how they'd planned to murder me and my unborn child. When she finished talking, Catherine asked if I had any questions. I only had one. Did my husband know she was going to do it that night? She hesitated. Catherine repeated the question. The ex-girlfriend looked at her lawyer, who nodded. She said my husband had known. He'd given her the key. He'd told her which smoke detector to avoid because he thought it might be functional. He'd made sure he was on shift that night. Made sure his crew would be the ones to respond. He'd told her to take the sleeping pill so he could claim he'd been in deep sleep, unable to wake up despite his training. Catherine asked for everything in writing. The ex-girlfriend agreed. I stood up and walked out of the conference room without saying a word. That night, I wrote it all down. Everything I remembered. Everything I'd learned. Not for the lawyers. For me. So I could look back someday and remember exactly how I'd felt when I realized the person I'd shared a bed with for 4 years had actively tried to have me killed. My sister found me at her kitchen table at 2 a.m, surrounded by pages of notes. She didn't ask what I was doing. She just made tea and sat with me until sunrise. The story kept growing. A journalist reached out, a woman named Diane who'd been following the case. She wanted to do a long-form piece. Catherine advised against it initially, but I called Diane anyway. I'd do it if she let me see the piece before publication, if she agreed to include all the evidence, if she promised to name my husband and his ex-girlfriend. She agreed. The interview took 6 hours. Diane was thorough, empathetic, and didn't shy away from hard questions. She asked about my marriage, about the signs I'd missed or ignored, about what it felt like to realize someone wanted you dead. I answered everything honestly. The article came out 3 weeks later. 10,000 words, photographs, copies of the security footage stills. It was devastating, comprehensive, impossible to spin or ignore. The fire department moved swiftly after that. My husband was terminated immediately. The crew members who'd failed to help me that night were suspended. The department issued a formal apology and announced a complete review of their protocols. The hospital where I'd been treated reached out through their legal department. They'd reviewed the case, found deficiencies in how I'd been initially treated. They wanted to settle. Catherine handled it. The settlement was significant. 2 doctors were quietly dismissed. It wouldn't bring back my daughter. Yes, I'd known the gender. A girl. I'd planned to name her after my grandmother. I planted a tree for her eventually. In my sister's backyard, where I was still living months after the fire. A cherry tree that would bloom every spring. I didn't put up a marker or a plaque. I didn't need one. I knew which tree was hers. The criminal trial was scheduled for 8 months out. My husband had been arrested, charged with conspiracy to commit murder and attempted murder. His bail was set at $2 million. He couldn't make it. The ex-girlfriend's deal was finalized. She'd plead guilty to attempted murder and arson, serve 8 years minimum, and testify fully against my husband. I started having good days occasionally. Days where I didn't think about the fire first thing when I woke up. Days where the future seemed possible instead of just empty. My sister started leaving college brochures around the house, counseling programs, social work, law. Patrick visited every few weeks. He'd bring updates from the old neighborhood, never asking how I was doing, just showing up. It was strangely comforting. The trial started on a Monday in February. The courthouse was packed. What I hadn't expected was the supporters, the women who lined up outside holding signs that said, "We believe her" and "Justice for victims." My husband looked different in his prison jumpsuit, smaller somehow. He didn't look at me when they led him into the courtroom. The prosecution presented their case over 2 weeks. The security footage played on a large screen for the jury. The ex-girlfriend's testimony, given via video conference. The firefighters' recordings, Patrick's doorbell video, medical records showing the extent of my injuries. My turn came on day 9. Catherine had prepared me for weeks. We'd practiced for hours, running through potential questions, discussing how to stay calm under pressure. We'd gone over every detail of my testimony, anticipated every trick the defense might try. "Don't perform," she'd said. "Don't try to make them feel sorry for you. Just tell them what happened, like you're explaining it to a friend. Be honest about your feelings, your fears, your mistakes. The jury needs to see you as a real person, not a perfect victim. Perfect victims don't exist. So that's what I did. I sat in the witness box, right hand raised to swear to tell the truth, and narrated the story clearly. The prosecutor, a woman in her 50s named Rebecca, efficient and compassionate in equal measure, asked questions designed to walk me through that night step by step. I answered them directly, making eye contact with the jurors when I could, letting them see that I had nothing to hide. Yes, I'd suspected an affair. For months, actually. Little things that didn't add up. Texts he'd delete. Calls he'd take in another room. The smell of perfume that wasn't mine. But more than that, the emotional distance. The way he'd look through me instead of at me. The way he'd flinch when I touched him, like my hands burned. Yes, I'd installed cameras because I felt unsafe. Not physically at first, but psychologically. I felt like I was being watched, followed, manipulated. I needed proof that I wasn't losing my mind. I needed evidence that what I was experiencing was real. Yes, I'd woken to smoke and called 911 instead of my husband because something told me not to trust him. I couldn't have explained it then. It was pure instinct. The same instinct that makes animals flee before earthquakes. Some part of me, some ancient survival mechanism, screamed danger when I thought about waking him, so I didn't. I walked the jury through that night minute by minute. The smell of smoke, the dispatcher's calm voice, climbing through the window, seeing the ex-girlfriend on the lawn, watching my husband run to her instead of looking for me, the interrogation by his crew while my house burned, the debris hitting my stomach, the blood, the waiting, the ambulance leaving with her inside, and my husband never once looking back to see if his wife was still alive. Rebecca showed the security footage. I had to watch it again, projected on the large screen for the entire courtroom to see. The ex-girlfriend entering my house with the gas can at 2:47 in the morning, walking through my rooms like she owned them, pouring the gasoline with careful precision, lighting it, the panic when it spread too fast, her escape through the window, the performance on the lawn. The jury's faces changed as they watched. Horror replacing skepticism, anger replacing doubt. One woman in the front row shook her head slowly, her hand over her mouth. A man in the back looked at my husband with undisguised disgust. Then Patrick's doorbell footage. The timestamp showing 47 seconds from when I hit the ground until someone started helping me. 47 seconds of me lying there. Clearly visible, clearly injured, clearly bleeding. 47 seconds of my husband directing all attention to his ex-girlfriend, his body language protective and tender with her, while I might have been dying yards away. 47 seconds that felt like an eternity watching it now. In this courtroom with strangers bearing witness to my husband's choice. The medical records were entered into evidence. The emergency hysterectomy, the permanent damage, the fact that I'd been 5 months pregnant and lost everything. Rebecca asked me to describe what that loss meant, what it felt like, what it had taken from me. I took a breath. This was the part I'd been dreading, talking about my daughter, making her real to strangers who'd never meet her, who'd never see her smile or hear her laugh or watch her grow. But she deserved to be mourned. She deserved to be more than a medical term on a hospital report. I told them I'd wanted that baby more than anything, that I'd already picked out a name, my grandmother's name, a woman I'd loved fiercely, that I'd bought tiny clothes, impossibly small socks and soft cotton onesies, that I'd painted a corner of our bedroom soft yellow, gender-neutral with clouds and stars, that I'd read to her every night, my hand on my belly, talking to her about the world she'd enter, that I'd imagined her first steps, her first words, teaching her to ride a bike, helping her with homework, watching her become whoever she was meant to be, that I'd woken up some mornings in those early weeks after the fire, still forgetting for a moment that she was gone, still reaching for my stomach before remembering it was flat and scarred and empty, still listening for movement that would never come, still grieving not just who she was, but who she would have been, all the potential and possibility extinguished before she ever got a chance. My voice broke. I didn't try to hide it. Let them see. Let them feel even a fraction of what had been taken. 2 jurors were crying openly. Several others looked furious. Rebecca let the moment sit, let the weight of it fill the courtroom. Then she moved on, asking about the recovery, the investigations, the evidence that had emerged. I answered everything, detailed and clear, watching my husband in my peripheral vision. He still wasn't looking at me, still staring at the table in front of him, like if he looked hard enough, he could disappear into it. My husband's lawyer tried to shake me during cross-examination, suggested I'd been paranoid, controlling, jealous. Asked why I'd installed secret cameras if I trusted my husband. I looked at the jury when I answered. I said I'd installed cameras because my gut told me I needed protection in my own home. I said suspicion based on evidence isn't paranoia. I said nothing about an affair justified planning someone's murder. Patrick testified. The firefighter testified. The arson expert testified about patterns, about the ex-girlfriend's previous investigation. My husband's defense was weak. His lawyer tried to argue that he'd been manipulated by his ex-girlfriend, that he'd been guilty of infidelity but not murder. The recordings proved otherwise. His own words, talking about wanting me gone, about being trapped. The jury deliberated for 6 hours, guilty on all counts. I didn't cry. I just felt tired. So incredibly tired. The judge scheduled sentencing for 3 weeks out. The sentencing hearing was shorter. The judge sentenced my husband to 32 years for the attempted murder charge alone. He'd be eligible for parole in 25 years. He'd be 61 years old. The next morning, I met with a realtor. I'd decided to leave the state entirely. I chose a small city in the southeast. The settlement money meant I could buy a house outright. Nothing fancy, just a small 3-bedroom with a porch and a yard. The therapy helped. My therapist said healing wasn't linear, that some days I'd feel fine and others I'd feel like I was drowning. She was right. I started a blog. Anonymous at first, just a place to process everything. I wrote about what it felt like to realize you'd been sleeping next to someone who wanted you dead. The responses were overwhelming. Hundreds of women writing to say they'd experienced similar things. So I started writing advice. How to document evidence. How to recognize patterns of control. How to leave safely. The blog grew. A domestic violence organization reached out. They wanted to partner with me, use my platform to reach more women. I said yes. The first workshop was in a community center basement. 12 women showed up. The room smelled like old coffee and cleaning solution, with metal folding chairs arranged in a circle. Someone had put out store-brand cookies on a paper plate. Fluorescent lights flickered overhead. The space was depressing, honestly, but it was free and it was available. I was terrified I'd mess it up. My hands were shaking when I stood up to introduce myself. I'd prepared notes, bullet points, things I wanted to cover. But when I looked at these 12 faces, I realized notes wouldn't cut it. They didn't need a lecture. They needed to know they weren't alone. So I told them my story. Not all of it, not every detail, but enough. The gaslighting, the fire, the baby I'd lost, the security cameras that had saved my case. When I finished, the silence in the room was absolute. Then one woman started clapping, then another. Then they were all clapping, some of them with tears streaming down their faces. We spent 3 hours together that first night. I taught them about documentation, how to use cloud backup for photos so they couldn't be deleted from your phone, how to set up a separate email account your partner didn't know about, accessed only from library computers or a friend's phone, how to take screenshots of threatening messages before they disappeared, how to record conversations in states where single-party consent was legal, keeping that recording device hidden where it couldn't be found. I showed them how to recognize when normal arguments crossed into coercion, when "I love you" became "I love you, so you have to do what I say," when concern became control, when jealousy became isolation, how to identify the pattern, the explosion, the apology, the honeymoon period, the tension building, the cycle that repeats and repeats until you can't remember who you were before it started. We talked about financial preparation, opening a bank account at a different institution, one with no branches near your home, stashing small amounts of cash where it wouldn't be noticed, even $5 or $10 at a time, making copies of important documents, birth certificates, and social security cards and passports, keeping them somewhere safe, somewhere outside the home, a friend's house, a storage unit rented in your maiden name, a safe deposit box at that different bank. I taught them about building a support network, not just friends, though friends mattered, but specific people for specific purposes. Someone who would hide you without asking questions. Someone who would lie to your partner about where you were. Someone who had a spare room or a couch or even just a car you could sleep in for a night. Someone who would believe you even when your story sounded crazy. One woman raised her hand and asked how you knew when it was time to leave. I didn't have a simple answer. I told her what my therapist had told me. If you're asking that question, if you're researching escape plans, if you're sitting in a workshop about domestic violence, then part of you already knows the answer. Trust that part. One woman stayed after. She was maybe 25, wearing long sleeves despite the heat, picking at her cuticles until they bled. Her name was Sophie. She said she'd been trying to figure out if her boyfriend's behavior was abusive or if she was overreacting. He'd never hit her, she explained, voice barely above a whisper. Just grabbed her sometimes when she tried to leave during arguments. Just blocked doorways so she couldn't walk away. Just threw things near her, not at her. Just near enough to scare her. Just controlled what she wore because he said other men would look at her. Just checked her phone constantly because he said if she had nothing to hide, she wouldn't mind. Just made her account for every minute of her day because he said that's what people who love each other do. The word just, over and over again, minimizing each thing individually, not seeing the pattern collectively. That's what they do, I told her. They make each incident seem small, reasonable even. They make you feel crazy for being upset about little things. But it's not little. It's never little. She said listening to my story made her realize she wasn't crazy, that her instincts were right, that the voice in her head telling her to run wasn't paranoia but survival instinct, the same instinct that had made me call 911 instead of my husband. She left with a safety plan, phone numbers programmed into her phone under fake names. Pizza place was actually the local shelter. Plumber was actually the crisis hotline. I gave her my personal number too. Told her to call anytime if she needed help. Day or night, didn't matter. She promised she would. 3 days later, she did. Her boyfriend had found the workshop materials in her bag, hidden in a textbook. She was calling from a gas station bathroom, voice shaking, asking what to do. She couldn't go home. He'd destroyed her phone in a rage, but she'd grabbed the store phone off the counter when he wasn't looking. Marcus and I picked her up 20 minutes later. We drove her to the shelter, helped her file a police report, connected her with a pro bono lawyer through Catherine's network. She was one of the first, but she wasn't the last. They never are. Every workshop produced 2, 3, sometimes 5 women who needed immediate help. Women who'd been sitting on the edge of leaving, who just needed someone to tell them it was okay, that they deserved better, that there was a path out. The firefighter who'd provided the recordings reached out too. He'd lost his job, unsurprisingly. The department claimed it was for violating recording policies, but we all knew it was retaliation. You don't break ranks and expect to keep your badge. His name was Marcus, 42, married with 3 kids, mortgage and car payments, and all the normal pressures of middle-class life. He looked exhausted and guilty and lost when we met at that coffee shop. He said he'd known something was wrong that night. The way his crew had acted didn't sit right. The way they'd all focused on the ex-girlfriend while a pregnant woman lay bleeding. The way nobody questioned the commander's orders, even though those orders violated every protocol they'd been taught. But he'd convinced himself it wasn't his place to question. That his colleagues knew what they were doing. That there must have been some reason, some explanation that made sense if you understood the full picture. Except there wasn't. There was just a commander protecting his mistress and a crew too loyal or too scared to speak up. And Marcus had stayed silent for weeks. His conscience eating him alive until he realized that silence made him complicit. That watching a crime and saying nothing was its own kind of crime. I told him I forgave him. I'm not sure I meant it completely, not then. The forgiveness would come later, earned through his actions rather than granted by my words. But it seemed like the thing to say in that moment, and maybe saying it started the process of making it true. He started crying in the coffee shop, this big man in work clothes with calloused hands and broad shoulders. People at other tables stared. I let him cry. He'd earned that too, in a different way. The right to grieve what he'd lost by doing the right thing too late. He became an advocate after that. Started speaking at fire departments about ethics and duty and the danger of looking the other way. About how loyalty to your crew can't supersede responsibility to the public. About how brotherhood isn't the same as covering for criminals. He was good at it, compelling in a way I could never be. When I spoke, people saw a victim seeking justice. When Marcus spoke, they saw one of their own warning them not to make his mistakes. His wrongful termination case eventually settled. Not for as much as Catherine thought he deserved, but enough. He used some of the money to start a nonprofit focused on accountability and emergency services. Training programs for recognizing domestic violence when the perpetrator was a colleague. Protocols for reporting misconduct. Support systems for whistleblowers who'd face retaliation for doing the right thing. We'd collaborate sometimes, his organization and mine. Teaching first responders how to recognize signs of abuse. How to document evidence properly when responding to domestic calls. How to protect victims even when the abuser wore the same uniform. It was slow work, fighting against a culture that valued loyalty above almost everything else. But every department that adopted our training, every officer who spoke up instead of staying silent, felt like progress. The organization kept growing beyond what I'd imagined in those early days. We rented an actual office downtown, 3 rooms and a small waiting area with donated furniture and plants that somehow stayed alive despite our collective inability to remember to water them. We had volunteers, other survivors who'd been through our program and wanted to give back. Women who'd escaped and rebuilt and wanted to help others do the same. We had partnerships with law enforcement, with legal aid, with therapists, and shelters. We had funding from grants and donations and the occasional speaking engagement I do at universities or conferences. Never enough funding, never as much as we needed, but enough to keep the doors open and the programs running. Enough to make a difference. The workshops were monthly now, sometimes twice a month when demand required it. We'd outgrown the community center basement, moved to a church that let us use their space for free. 20, 30, sometimes 40 women would show up. Young and old, rich and poor, every race and background. Abuse didn't discriminate. It found whoever it could convince they deserved it. I was invited to testify before the state legislature about reforms to domestic violence laws. 3 of the bills I supported passed. Marcus became a regular presence in my life. Not romantic, just solid friendship built on shared purpose. He'd stop by the office, help with workshop setup, tell terrible jokes. I started dating eventually, very cautiously. Then I met someone at a workshop. Not a participant, a volunteer. He'd been referred by Marcus, another firefighter who'd left his department after witnessing corruption. His name was James, 45, divorced, with a teenage daughter. He didn't ask about my past. He just showed up every week, helped set up chairs, made coffee. We started talking after workshops. Then we started getting dinner. He was patient with my boundaries, understanding about my triggers. He didn't try to save me. He just treated me like a person he enjoyed being around. 2 years after the fire, I went back to the old neighborhood. I drove past the lot where my house had been. The new house was finished. A young family visible through the windows. Kids playing in the yard. Normal life. Continuing. I visited Patrick. He'd moved to a retirement community. He seemed happy there. Showed me photos of his great-grandchildren. He said he still thought about that night. Still felt grateful he'd been able to help. I told him about the organization. About James. About the life I'd built. He said he was proud of me. Said his wife would have been too. Before I left, I drove to the cemetery where I'd buried the ashes of the baby I'd lost. I hadn't been back since the funeral, but now I could. I sat by the small marker, simple granite with just her name and dates. My grandmother's name. I told her about everything she'd missed. About the trial, about the organization, about James. I told her I was sorry I hadn't been able to protect her. I told her I was trying to protect other people now, in her memory. The wind picked up, and I let myself believe she heard me. The years that followed were a mix of building and healing. Patrick passed away from cancer 4 years after the fire. I was with him at the end, holding his hand in that hospice room while he drifted in and out of consciousness. In one of his lucid moments, he squeezed my hand and said he was glad he'd been there that night. That saving me had given the end of his life meaning he didn't know he needed. I scattered some of his ashes under the cherry tree next to where I'd buried my daughters, the 2 people who'd marked the end of one life and the beginning of another. The organization grew beyond what I'd imagined. 4 cities with real offices, employees with actual salaries and benefits, thousands of women helped, partnerships with law enforcement agencies that had once been hostile to our message. We'd trained over 200 police departments, 50 fire stations, countless medical professionals. I published a book about my experience. It reached people I never could have reached otherwise, women in small towns and isolated situations who'd never attend a workshop, but could read my story in secret and recognize themselves in it. The ex-girlfriend was released after serving 6 years. She moved back to Arizona. I had a Google alert set up for her name, just in case. I'd learned to trust my instincts about potential threats. My ex-husband still had 19 years left on his sentence. I'd gotten letters from him occasionally over the years. I never responded, burned each one without reading them after that first time. Marcus continued advocating. His nonprofit grew. We collaborated often. James proposed on an ordinary Tuesday evening. We were making dinner in my kitchen, and he just stopped stirring the pasta and said he wanted to spend the rest of his life with me, if I'd let him. No ring yet, he said. Wanted to pick it out together if I said yes. I said yes. Not because I needed saving or completion, but because I wanted him in my life, wanted to build something together, wanted to choose love even after everything. We got married in my sister's backyard, under the cherry tree. Small ceremony, close friends. Patrick would have been proud. Marcus was there with his family. Catherine came. My ex-husband sent a letter from prison. James found it in the mail and asked if I wanted him to throw it away unread. I said no, said I needed to see what he'd finally found the courage to say. The letter was 3 pages long. An apology, he claimed. An explanation. He said he'd been selfish and stupid and cruel. He said he understood now what he'd done. He said he hoped I'd found peace. He said he was sorry. I read it twice, then burned it in the fireplace. James held my hand while we watched it turn to ash. The apology didn't matter. The explanation didn't matter. Nothing he said could undo what he'd done or change what I'd lost. But I was okay anyway. That was the thing he'd never understand. I'd survived him. I'd built a life he couldn't touch. I'd found purpose and love and meaning despite everything he'd tried to take from me. I still had bad days. Days when the grief over my daughter hit me sideways. Days when I saw a pregnant woman and had to fight back tears. But I also had good days. Great days. Days when I laughed until my stomach hurt. Days when I woke up next to James and felt genuinely happy. The scar on my abdomen never faded completely. Some days I hated looking at it. Other days I saw it as proof of my strength, evidence that I'd endured something meant to kill me and came out the other side. 5 years after the fire, I stood in my garden watching that tree bloom, full and pink and alive. James was grilling on the porch. Music played from somewhere down the street. Normal, beautiful. I thought about the woman I'd been 5 years ago, pregnant and terrified in a burning house. If I could tell her anything, it would be this. You survive. More than that, you live. You build something meaningful. You find real love. You help people. You matter. My ex-husband tried to erase me, to remove me like I was an inconvenience. Instead, he created something he never anticipated. A woman with nothing left to lose and everything to fight for. I won. Not immediately, not easily, but definitively. I'm here, thriving, making a difference. He's in prison, forgotten except as a cautionary tale. And me? I'm standing in my garden watching flowers bloom, planning the next workshop, thinking about the life James and I are building. Living fully. That's the victory. Choosing to keep going when it would be easier to stop. I chose it. Every single day, I choose it. And that choice is how I won.